God honors humility. Though all of us are vulnerable to the sin of pride, God will respond positively when we respond to His discipline with true humility. Here's Gene.
When we look at this story, when we look at what happened to Hezekiah, we actually have two lessons here. One is that we want to finish strong. Now, he finished strong, but he had a problem, and we're going to see what that is. The other lesson that really comes out of this story from his life, this event in his life, relates to humility, and of course the principle focuses on humility. Let's read about it. 2 Chronicles chapter 32, verse 24. In those days, Hezekiah became sick to the point of death. So he prayed to the Lord, and he spoke to him and gave him a miraculous sign. Now, what we've got to do here is fill in some gaps, because the miraculous sign is not spelled out here in 2 Chronicles. But if you go back to 2 Kings chapter 20, we have an elaboration on this story, and there you find out what the miraculous sign really is. And you'll see how God really responded to his prayer when he was sick unto death. And because of his prayer, God said, I'm going to give you another 15 years. I'm going to add 15 years to your life. And Hezekiah said, well, will you give me a sign? And so God literally gave him a sign. And the sign was a choice between whether or not the sundial moves forward or moves backwards. And Hezekiah said, well, if it moves forward, that's easy to misinterpret as being a sign. If it moves backwards, that is a real sign. This is the sundial moving backwards in terms of time. And so God gave him that sign. But the fact of the matter is that he took that sign and God's mercy for granted. He didn't respond as he should. That's what we read about. So let me just start over with this passage so you get the flow and the continuity. In those days, Hezekiah became sick to the point of death, so he prayed to the Lord, and he spoke to him and gave him a miraculous sign. However, because his heart was proud, Hezekiah didn't respond according to the benefit that had come to him. God had given him a tremendous benefit. 15 years of extra life, gave him a sign, a miraculous sign, but even then, he didn't respond with true humility. According to the benefit, he took that grace for granted. So we read, so God wasn't happy. There was wrath on him, on Judah and Jerusalem. Now, you see, you need to understand the context that God's wrath didn't all of a sudden drop on him. This was a process of taking for granted God's grace. Then Hezekiah humbled himself. Finally, God really got his attention. Then Hezekiah humbled himself for the pride of his heart, he and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so the Lord's wrath didn't come on them during Hezekiah's lifetime. Now, the great lesson, obviously, here is the temptation to be proud. And the fascinating thing to me as I look at this is, I don't care how old we get as a believer. I mean, it doesn't matter how many blessings you've had, how many good things you've done, how many steps you have taken to walk in the will of God. If we're not careful, we're all vulnerable to pride. And so Hezekiah fell into that trap. And that certainly corresponds with what Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians. Chapter 10, verse 12, he said, therefore, whoever thinks he stands must be careful not to fall. I think there were probably times when Hezekiah, because he was having all of this great response from the people of Israel, people responding, destroying the idols, not just in Judah, but far north, going to all those cities. The temptation to say, you know, I'm a pretty good king here. I'm doing a lot of good things here. God's really using me here. And then he gets sick to death. God has mercy on him, but he takes it for granted. He doesn't respond in accordance with the grace that God has given him. And so consequently, he was disciplined by the Lord. And perhaps Paul was thinking about that event when he wrote, "Whoever thinks he stands must be careful not to fall." A great lesson here in relationship to our lives today. Here's the principle. Here's the lesson, really. Though all of us are vulnerable to the sin of pride, God will respond positively when we respond to his discipline with true humility. See, this is the really positive lesson that comes out of this situation. That when he humbled himself, God responded, regardless. You're going to see in the next king, who was an evil man, when he responded in humility, God responded to him. God really responds to humility, regardless of the mistakes that we make, when we truly, truly humble ourselves. You know, Peter speaks about this when he wrote his first letter, 1 Peter chapter 5. All of you, clothe yourselves with humility. Why did Peter write that to a group of Christians? Because we're vulnerable. Doesn't matter who we are. All of you, clothe yourselves with humility towards one another, because God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. That's perfectly illustrated in the life of Hezekiah. Just read that with Hezekiah in mind. God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And then he says, humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that he may exalt you at the proper time. Well, let's think about application. Reflection and response. How do we respond to this? Here's the question. Why are we so prone to pride? And why is it at times so difficult to respond with humility? Well, I think one answer is that the root of sin is pride. It goes all the way back to the garden. It goes all the way back to Satan, who tried to exalt himself above the Most High and was cast out of heaven. And ever since Satan was cast out of heaven, he tries to tempt us in the area of pride. And that's why he actually tempted Jesus. Remember when Jesus was tempted in the wilderness after he had fasted for 40 days. Every temptation was based on pride. Notice what Satan said. The first temptation. If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread. What's the root of that? It's pride. You see, he's really tempting Jesus in the area of his humanity. Now, Jesus could have changed those stones into bread. But he's tempting him in the area of his humanity. And Jesus responded and said, that's not right. I won't do that. The second temptation, if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down. What's the root of that? It's pride. Jesus had come to humble himself, not to exalt himself. And notice the next temptation. I will give you all these things if you'll fall down and worship me. Again, appealing to pride, to self, to ego. So it shouldn't surprise us that Satan will tempt us in the area of pride. It shouldn't surprise us as that's what he did with Hezekiah. That's what he did with all the kings of Judah, all the kings of Israel. Throughout Scripture, that's one of his primary attacks, because sin is rooted in pride. And Satan knows that. So we have to be on guard. He that think he stands, take heed lest he fall. But here's a question that relates to application, that is, why is it difficult to respond with humility? You ever thought about that? I think there are several reasons. One is self-protection. See, one of the ways in which we want to protect ourselves is not to admit our faults. And when we don't want to admit our faults, that's pride. We're trying to protect ourselves. And, you know, it takes a lot of courage to say, I'm sorry. There are some people that really struggle saying, I'm sorry. Why? Because of pride. And it's saying, I'm sorry, that reflects humility and reflects God's blessing in our lives, because God honors humility. Pride, self-protection. Well, I think Hezekiah really illustrates true humility because he did it in front of all Israel. Notice what we read, 2 Chronicles 32:26, picking up that statement again. You may have missed this the first time around. Then Hezekiah humbled himself for the pride of his heart, he and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. So the Lord's wrath didn't come on them during Hezekiah's lifetime. How did the inhabitants of Jerusalem know that the king had humbled himself? Because it was obvious in front of all Israel, all of those from Judah, all the people that were there. It was a public demonstration of humility. And consequently, all of those in Judah and those in Israel who knew about the king's humility, his confession of humility, also humbled themselves. So you have here an illustration of personal humility and an illustration of corporate humility. And God honored that, and God blessed them. So here's the principle. Let me restate it. Though all of us are vulnerable to the sin of pride, God will respond positively when we respond to his discipline with true humility.